and welcome to Press Review with me, Carmen Cracknell. Today we'll take a look at Hezbollah-US relations as we are joined by political analyst Chris Bambery, who will be discussing the ongoing Syrian conflict. But first, as usual, let's take a look at the front pages of the newspapers here in the UK. The Guardian leads its front page news reporting on the Obama review panel, which sees that the National Security Agency should be banned from attempting to undermine the security of the internet and stripped of its power to collect telephone records in bulk. The paper also reports on Arctic 30 protesters and Pussy Riot members who are set to walk free in a few days after a wide-ranging amnesty law was passed by the Russian parliament on Wednesday, and features a report on the city issuing interest rates warning as unemployment falls to 7.4%. The Independent leads its front page reporting on British tax authorities accused of siding with big business over small firms and individuals. Westminster told them today to take from the poor but not the rich. The paper also features an article looking at a plan to ban councils from using the phrase bedroom tax, under moves to give Eric Pickles, the community secretary, the power to veto the contentious language, and features a picture of a Syrian boy carrying an AK-47 rifle in the Sheikh Maqsood district of Aleppo. The Daily Telegraph leads its front page with a story about the head of the armed forces who has warned that cuts in manpower could leave Britain with no one to operate in its high-tech equipment. It also features a warning from the National Trust, who says that ministers are presiding over a steady erosion of the Greenbelt, after a survey disclosed that more than half of councils are planning to build on protected rural land, though other sites were available. It also reports on David Cameron, who today will pay tribute to members of his family who died during the First World War. Now let's take a look at the top stories in the Middle East. As Hezbollah indicates a changing attitude towards the US, let's take a look at what analysts are saying regarding Hezbollah in Lebanon. Al-Monitor features an analysis by Jean Aziz titled "Nasrallah Hints at Change in Approaches to US Lebanon." When asked by Al-Monitor about Washington-Tehran relations, Nasrallah responded that the Iranian position as far as Israel is concerned is decisive. He said as far as the US is concerned, however, Iranians would always say the day the Americans recognize our rights, treat us with respect, negotiate with us as peers, give the people of this region their rights, abandon their hegemonic approach, sense of entitlement, arrogance, wars and monopoly, we will be ready to negotiate with them, be it directly or indirectly. Aziz writes of the speech, although Nasrallah's response confirmed the rhetoric of a rivalry between his camp and US policy in the region, it's also the case that he, for the first time, dropped the rhetoric of abuse, absolute hostility between the two sides. Aziz adds that it is the contentious history between the two parties that led Hezbollah to be added to the US list of terrorist organisations and drove Washington's efforts in pushing to have it added to the EU's terror list in July 2013. Aziz also adds that Nasrallah rushed to deny that his party had a project in mind that was bigger than Lebanon. He quotes him as saying, "Hezbollah is with the Amal movement and Imam Musa al-Sadr. I would also like to declare tonight Hezbollah believes in the finality of the Lebanese entity, despite the rejection by Hezbollah at its inception of the Lebanese nation and state." In 2006, Hezbollah made clear it was no longer hesitant to declare its Lebanese identity and its open and full commitment to the state and the nation. Regarding the party declaration that it believes in Lebanon as the home for all its people, Aziz concludes that this and Nasrallah's pronouncements on the US are significant developments for Hezbollah that everyone must consider given their importance to the future of Lebanon and the region. The Daily Star has published a piece titled "President Politicians Warn of Growing Islamist Threat." Speaker Nabih Berri was quoted as saying to MPs during a weekly meeting that the terror group behind attacks seek to turn Lebanon into an arena for jihad. The article says the army has come under attack in recent days. A soldier was killed and 3 others were wounded Sunday in 2 separate attacks by gunmen on army checkpoints in South Lebanon. Rockets fired from Syria into the northeastern city of Hermel Tuesday wounded 2 soldiers. According to the article, the president reiterated his call for the Lebanese to raise their level of vigilance in the face of repeated attempts to transfer violence and terrorism to Lebanon, the most recent being in Baalbek and Hermel, and to continue combating terrorism and confront it with all force. The article adds that Baalbek MP blamed Lebanon's policy of disassociation from the Syrian crisis for the infiltration of jihadists into the country to implement what he said were their plots in the region, saying the disassociation policy adopted by the Lebanese government paved the way for the radical Takfiri forces that have infiltrated Lebanon to serve the plot of dividing the region, which began in Iraq, then Syria, and now arrived to Lebanon. The MP added, the others accept that these groups attack the resistance but denies that they attack the military. They also appeal for their release once they are detained. An opinion piece in Sharq al-Awsat by Ayad Abu Shakra titled "The Political Incubator and the Iranian Project" examines Hezbollah and foreign interference in Lebanon. Abu Shakra writes that factions during the Lebanese civil war believed they were armed in self-defense, but later on they laid down their arms because they saw the objective of reconstructing the country was far more important than destroying it, eventually reaching an agreement at Taif. He says that as Israel was occupying South Lebanon, most parties in Lebanon thought they shared a vision, but when Israel withdrew in 2000, Hezbollah refused to disarm. Lebanon's request to Syria to inform the UN that the farms and the hills were in fact Lebanese, Syria refused all requests, insisting instead on a complete demarcation of the border, beginning from North Lebanon. Speaking of Hariri, the author writes, the assassination was not in reality aimed against a person, but rather at eliminating a national political phenomenon with significant regional dimensions, awakened many Lebanese and Arabs from their slumber. He adds the Syrian military withdrawal left Lebanon under the guardianship of a more powerful and effective alternative, which was also more capable of infiltrating the Lebanese political scene. This was Hezbollah, a religious party come militia founded by the Islamic Republic of Iran in the 80s, which also sponsored and trained its members. Abu Shakra describes Hezbollah as an armed political power, making alliances and enemies, funding and protecting its followers, and imposing the appointment of its cronies on the state, even ones from other sects, as part of its plan to infiltrate them. This was made possible thanks to the fact that it was the only political organisation with arms and money described as clean money by one of its leaders. He concludes that Lebanon is currently facing dangerous challenges over the coming few weeks, including the repercussions of the Syrian crisis and the upcoming presidential elections. He writes, hatred has reached a point where some Sunni areas in Lebanon have become incubators of militant fundamentalism, just like they did in Syria and Iraq, and never by choice, allowing Iran's hegemony project to continue unabated under the banner of resistance may push the region into the unknown. As diplomats prepare for an oft-postponed international peace conference on Syria next month, we take a look at why analysts are pessimistic about the outcome of the talks and UK policy on Syria. Dr. Mohammed Abdo Al-Ibrahim writes an opinion piece in the Syria Times headlined "The Wahhabi Cannibals," in which he looks at the recent declarations of the Saudi ambassador to London, Mohammed bin Nawaf bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, in the New York Times. Al-Ibrahim argues that the ambassador is trying to hide the destructive role of Al Saud in inflaming the Syria crisis, slaughtering the Syrians. Hence, facts on the ground do prove without fail that the Saudi-affiliated Wahhabi terrorists are responsible for the most heinous crimes of the 21st century. The Wahhabi cannibals have been burning churches, mosques, sacred monuments, slitting throats, cutting heads, and perpetrating more of their barbarity. According to Al-Ibrahim, the Saudi ambassador is threatening the Syrians inside their own Syria of more flagrant, brutal and savage interference in the Syrians' domestic affairs. Personally, I appeal to every secular and open-minded man to carry arms and fight the terrorism of Al Saud in their own courtyard. Al Saud have to taste their own handmade poisonous medicine. Al-Ibrahim sees that the majority of the Syrians are indeed indebted to every resistance freedom fighter who stands by them in defending the values of freedom, humanity and civilization. The majority of the Syrians do like light, progress and true religion. This majority does not hate darkness, ignorance and Wahhabi heretics. To conclude, Al-Ibrahim claims that the Wahhabi ambassador is in London because of the Saudi petrodollars and treason. It is an old alliance between colonial powers and the slaves. The slaves in no way can master a profession other than being slaves. Their role and profession is but slavery. The Daily Star features an article headlined "Lessons from History Point to a Long Civil War," written by Bernard de Busman, who claims that as diplomats prepare for an oft-postponed international peace conference in Syria next month, a look at past civil wars suggests that the Syrian conflict is far from resolution. According to de Busman, on average, civil wars since 1945 have lasted around 10 years. By that measure, Syria's 33-month-old war is in its early stages. That helps explain growing doubts that the forthcoming peace conference planned for the Swiss city of Montreux for January 22nd could hasten the end of a multi-sided conflict. De Busman refers to French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius, who sounded a note of deep pessimism as saying, "We are working on the success of the talks, but we can have a great deal of doubt on that. If, sadly, it isn't successful, that would mean this martyred country will continue to suffer, as will its neighbours." De Busman also refers to John Kerry, the US Secretary of State, who has been trying to get the peace conference together for more than a year. This week described the situation as a huge sectarian mess. To conclude, de Busman states that next month's conference is a follow-up to a Geneva meeting in the summer of 2012 that laid out the framework of a settlement and included a condition that looks akin to squaring the circle, a transitional governing body with full executive powers that could include members of the Assad government and would be formed on the basis of mutual consent. Despite a flurry of diplomatic activity, that mutual consent is nowhere in sight. The British Daily Telegraph features an article headlined "How many more times can the Foreign Office get it so wrong?" Here Peter Oborne argues that a total misreading of the situation in Syria is just the latest example of Whitehall blundering. According to Oborne, this December has seen the final collapse of British and American policy in Syria. David Cameron's favourite general, Salim Idris, was meant to unify the rebels, bring down Assad and vanquish al-Qaeda. Instead, his Free Syrian Army has taken to its heels, giving up its equipment to its Islamist rivals, while Idris himself has reportedly gone on the run. Oborne points out that officially the Prime Minister still insists President Assad must go, but privately it is now a different story. The emergence of al-Qaeda and its various allies and associates has led to a sudden change of attitude. At a meeting in London last week, Syrian rebels were informed that removing President Bashar al-Assad was no longer the priority. Oborne believes that we are supposed to have first-class diplomatic and intelligence services, yet from the start of the rebellion they haven't had the faintest idea what was going on. Oborne claims that they failed to understand the underlying stability of the regime in Damascus, the strength of the army, the level of support among the population, and the loyalty of insiders. Oborne believes that the Foreign Office misunderstood the opposition. Despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, officials continue to believe that it was liberal, secular, pluralistic, and drawing room friendly. General Idris was supposed to be an independent military leader, another Foreign Office fantasy. Oborne suggests that our government misunderstood al-Qaeda. 2 years ago, in the wake of the killing of bin Laden, the British intelligence services were privately telling ministers that the terror group was all but defeated. Today, in part thanks to avoidable Western policy errors, al-Qaeda, under the leadership of bin Laden's successor Ayman al-Zawahiri, has been able to penetrate a new country from which it had previously been excluded. Oborne explains that these three elementary errors of analysis have deplorable effects on policy. He refers to a Chatham House analysis that was scathing, describing how Britain and the US have oscillated between explicit demands for President Assad to leave and implicit acceptance of him as a viable partner. Obon says that we have combined bellicose anti-regime rhetoric with inertia on the ground. The rebels were encouraged to rise against Assad without being given the means to do so. This was the exact combination that led to the slaughter of thousands of Shia rebels by Saddam Hussein in 1991 in the wake of the Gulf War. To conclude, Obon states that this catalogue of policy errors means that Britain and America must carry their share of the blame for the situation in Syria, not least the terrible humanitarian catastrophe unfolding this winter. Joining us on the show today is political analyst Chris Bambery. Hi Chris, can you hear me?
Hi, how are you? Yes, I can.
Thank you for joining us today. An article in The Telegraph today, written by Peter Obon, claims that the Foreign Office, who is reputed to be well informed on the Middle East, got the foreign policy on Syria wrong. Do you agree with this?
Absolutely, and I think it's interesting, as you said in your report, that in both Washington, in London, and indeed Paris, there is a considerable reassessment going on. The French Foreign Secretary, Laurent Fabius, to add to this mix, has said that the Syrian National Council and the Free State Army are in serious trouble, and he's pessimistic about their role in the talks that will begin in Montreux next week, probably. And that's added to this report by Peter Obon, who's a very incisive journalist who I would very much trust on these matters. So yes, I think they did get it wrong, and I think his explanation for it is quite good as well.
Yeah, and the article also suggests that few officials in today's FCO have intellectual confidence to place latest intelligence from Riyadh in its proper context, especially when to do so might irritate Washington. Why do you think this is, and why might it irritate Washington?
Well, I think there's two things. First, I think it's interesting he points out that under the Tony Blair government, in and around the time of the invasion of Iraq, essentially the Foreign Office was kind of hollowed out in order to ensure it was in tune with George W. Bush and Tony Blair. Many Foreign Office experts who knew and understood Middle East affairs were, of course, ignored over the decision to invade Iraq and were simply shunted off. So the Foreign Office was reshaped to be compliant towards the joint British-American policy. Secondly, of course, is Britain's foreign policy is not independent in any way. Britain's foreign policy is to stay as close as possible to Washington in every matter. And we recall that David Cameron was particularly upset when British MPs voted not to go to war over Syria because he saw that as a fundamental break in what is claimed to be a special relationship between Washington and London. And in fact, actually, ensured that Obama did not carry out the strikes on Syria. But, I think it shows you, and that special relationship isn't really a relationship. It's a very one-sided one, but the Americans calling the tune, and indeed paying the piper, in the sense that, as we know from Edward Snowden's revelations, the Americans are paying the British millions of dollars for this huge spying operation at GCHQ, which is not at all independent. It's it's part of the whole American security agency. So there is no real independent British foreign policy here.
Yeah, and also according to the article, British foreign policy has become emotional. What does that mean?
I think what it means is really we were told that President Assad was the devil incarnate, and that's why he had to be removed. And we've had, a whole series of stories about how bad the Assad regime was, and and of course there is some elements of truth to that. I don't want to be an apologist for the Assad regime, but of course in recent weeks and months we have had much more disturbing stories coming out of rebel-ruled areas where we see Al-Qaeda-like groups carrying out executions, beheading people, kidnapping Christian nuns and bishops and so forth and so on. And I think what's interesting here, it's unfortunate it took the tragedy involving Christians for this to get across in this country. By and large, I think until then the media had ignored what was happening to the Shia, Alawites and others. But when it started involving Christians, and we had the Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Anglican Church, speaking out over the treatment of Christians in Syria, and indeed Prince Charles yesterday speaking out over the treatment of Christians in Syria. Really, they could no longer ignore this. This is entering the public domain. And people were quite shocked that, we were providing non-lethal assistance, and indeed more. We were providing training, it is a well-known fact, to these people. And they are carrying out, human rights abuses on a scale unimaginable. And, we are welcoming Al-Qaeda into our camp, if you like. And then also the shock to discover there are some 300 plus British Salafists fighting in Syria. The Foreign Secretary, William Hague, raised the alarm over that and said there might be some, these people might come home to engage in what he terms the war on terror. I personally am more worried they might come home and engage in that kind of sectarian violence against fellow Muslims, which we've seen them performing in Syria.
Absolutely, all very interesting points. So finally, do you believe that UK foreign policy on the Middle East is causing problems at home?
I think that the UK's foreign policy in the Middle East is in tatters, and I think anyone looking at it can think it lacks any credibility. You know, David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, was gung-ho to intervene in Syria. Then the House of Commons went against him. You know, he looked humiliated then. There's no coherence over the Syria plan. And, you know, and now we have, as I said, in both the Pentagon, in London and in Paris, people privately saying, well, actually, it's probably better to keep Assad because that's the least worst option on the table in Syria. And going into these talks in Montreux, trying to say we don't want to overthrow Assad. The talks in Montreux are a bit of a joke because, quite frankly, as another journalist said in a piece this week, Patrick Coburn, a well-informed journalist, the Free Syrian Army is melting away because it's either it's involved, if it's fighting at all, it's fighting against these Al-Qaeda people, or its forces have gone over to them. So the Free Syrian Army is really a shadow organization, and the Syrian National Council, as well known, represents nothing. So in a sense, the negotiations in Montreux, I think, are possibly going to be more directly between the Assad regime on the one hand and the West on the other. That then begs the question of where Saudi Arabia, Turkey and Qatar fit into it, but that's a different story.
Yeah, some really interesting points raised there. Thank you very much, Chris, for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thanks. Take care. Now let's take a look at the top headlines from international papers. The Moscow Times leads its front page with the headline, "Bailout tightens Putin's grip on Kiev." The International New York Times leads its front page news with the headline, "In Tunisia, recruiting teenagers for jihad." The Gulf News front page leads its news with the headline, "India passes landmark anti-corruption bill." And finally, the Global Times leads its front page with the headline, "FDI sees moderate rise." For more updates, please visit levant.tv. Goodbye for today.